sun has just risen over Sydney Harbour, and as I look down at Farm Cove, where the most memorable historic occasion is going to be celebrated today, I'm impressed with the scene, not only majesty of the harbour itself, but of the honour being done to the occasion by the people of Australia.
Australia calls you to hear the Right Honourable William Morris Hughes, Federal Minister for Health and Repatriation in Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Hughes.
Our history is short, but it has been cast in a wonderful age. Since the day when Captain Arthur Phillips sailed the first fleet into Port Jackson, the descendants of the first settlers and of others who followed in their train have by prodigious labours built up a great and flourishing state. And now we invite you to join with us in celebrating its 150th anniversary.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes.
Many of the thousands of people who are already lining the banks of Farm Cove, which form the domain, to see this spectacle, have been there overnight. And now they're already, amidst the scene of gay bunting which adorns the streets and the ships in the harbour, are ready to see reenacted the landing of Captain Phillips, an event which took place 150 years ago today. A page or a milestone in the history of Australia which will be remembered in the years to come.
The flag of England is hoisted again where it first flew in Australia, this time watched by thousands of Australian-born citizens of the Empire.
To drink the health of His Majesty King George III, the Queen, the Prince of Wales, and success to the new colony.
The focus of Sydney's sesquicentenary celebrations was the reenactment of the landing of Governor Arthur Phillip and the First Fleet. His lengthy speech launched the proceedings.
It is now fitting that we should turn our minds to the purpose underlying this enterprise, which is to plant a fresh sprig of empire in this new and vast land. It may be that this country will become the most valuable acquisition Britain has ever made.
In 1938, White Australia celebrated the 150th anniversary of British colonization. The sesquicentenary celebrations were expensive, elaborate, and popular. The Conservative government of Bertram Stevens wanted to do something big for New South Wales, something that would speed the state's slow recovery from depression. It was Governor Arthur Phillips' address that invited Australians to take pleasure in the imperial image of a proud and prosperous city.
It is therefore appropriate that I should express the vision which comes to me of a city stupendous in area and population, and of this magnificent harbour visited by merchantmen of all sizes, designs and nationalities, bringing goods for the growing population in this land and taking away this surplus produce of its soil. May the achievements of this little band of British people, separated by thousands of miles from kith and kin, lead to the foundation of such a city. In my mind, I see the inhabitants of this great country of the future reflecting with pride and gratitude upon the era of progress in which we this day lay the foundation.
The 1938 sesquicentenary tells us how people understood the history of Australia in imperial terms. It tells us how they believed that Australia was an imperial colony which had gone from what they regarded as a wilderness to a thriving, prosperous, modern society within the British Empire.
Phillips' vision worked as a dramatic, metaphysical way of articulating past and present. Phillip invited his audiences to see themselves from his point of view. Australians were proud and grateful citizens of the Empire, the beneficiaries, but not the agents of history. Not everyone shared the same enthusiasm for the nature of Australia's early settlement.
This spectacle of 150 years, so-called progress in Australia, commemorates also 150 years of misery and degradation imposed upon the original native inhabitants by the white invaders of this country.
The Aborigines Progressive Association declared the anniversary a day of mourning. they issued a manifesto.
You came here only recently, and you took our land away from us by force. You have almost exterminated our people, but there are enough of us remaining to expose the humbug of your claim as white Australians to be a civilised, progressive, kindly and humane nation. By your cruelty and callousness towards the Aborigines, you stand condemned in the eyes of the world.
In 1938, their struggle against the paternal control of the Protection Board failed. Aborigines were not to win the right to vote for another 30 years. The New South Wales Aborigines Protection Board made sure nobody contacted those Aborigines brought from Menindee and Brewarrina to perform in the reenactment. They were confined to a police barracks. Anniversary Day, the 26th of January, had never created much popular enthusiasm. Nor had Arthur Phillip earlier enjoyed such remarkable stature as the great hero of Australia's foundation. James Cook, a far more celebrated figure.
Captain Cook gazes towards the entrance of Sydney Harbour, which he passed by as a small inlet, little knowing that beyond the deceptive entrance lay of harbours, a harbour combining peerless beauty with commercial utility.
Captain Cook's party.
Oh, really? Oh, my.
You didn't get one, Jane, I don't think, because you were
Oh,
early.
thank you.
There you are.
1755. What is it, 1755?
The Victorian government marked their state centenary in 1934 by moving Cook's cottage from England to Melbourne.
Great Ayton, near Middlesbrough, workmen are dismantling Captain Cook's cottage stern by stern. It is to be re-erected in Melbourne, Australia, and there preserved as a lasting memorial to him. Each stern of the cottage as it is removed is marked according to a plan and placed ready for packing, each in its separate wooden box, before making the long journey to Australia. The most minute care is being taken so as to reinstate in Australian soil, in its most accurate detail, the picturesque dwelling of the famous adventurer, whose name is so intimately connected with the Commonwealth.
Cook was an explorer. He stood for the success of hard work and the progress of science, but he was not greatly concerned with Australia as a future British colony.
He was a figure who represented the Enlightenment, scientific exploration. He represented all sorts of things in the imagination of Australians, but he did not represent in that historical imagination the inauguration of British colonisation.
A very clear difference between Phillip and Cook was Phillip's status as a governor. Phillip was a representative of the Crown, and his presence placed Australia and New South Wales within a larger structure of government, the British Empire.
Well, the governor had a very important symbolic role. Of course, he was an imperial representative, and therefore he symbolically represented the empire. And for most Australians in the 1930s, that was what they wanted. Australia wanted to belong to the empire, and Australians regarded themselves as being historically linked to the British Empire. And the governor, with his plumes and his monarchical trappings of office, very much represented the British Crown and the traditions of British government and of monarchical system, of having a governor who was above politics, separate, away from the partisan, everyday political hurly-burly.
Fluttering proudly in the breeze is the Duke's royal standard, and in harmony with the occasion, all ships are dressed in bunting from stem to stern. His Excellency Governor-General of Australia, Sir Isaac Isaacs, arrives at Prince's Pier to join the Governor of Victoria, Lord Huntingfield, and the official party to greet the Duke on his landing. His Royal Highness, in the full dress uniform of the 10th Royal Hussars, today takes precedence over the Governor-General.
The most prominent figure in Victoria's celebrations for its 1934 centenary was Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester.
Mr. and Mrs. Melbourne have been waiting since early morning for the royal progress, and pay their tribute to the King's son, who by his obvious sincerity has endeared himself to the entire nation.
Your Excellency, in charging me with this mission, the King gave me the following message to deliver to him. It has given me great pleasure to send my son to represent me at the opening of the celebrations which are being held to commemorate the centenary of the settlement of the state of Victoria and of the founding of the city of Melbourne. This occasion must stir the hearts of all interested in our empire history. I have much pleasure in declaring the Centenary Celebrations open.
So the Centenary Celebrations are open, and with His Royal Highness driving away, this memorable function comes to a close, brightly and brilliantly inaugurated.
If you look at the Victorian centenary in 1934-35, what you have there is one figure also occupying a pivotal, central position in the whole spectacle, and that was a member of the royal family. And if you look at other events, other pivotal rituals, as it were, in Australian public, social, political life, you often find at the heart of them a member of the royal family who is there to inaugurate proceedings. And so Philip seems to be playing a similar sort of role in the 1938 celebrations. The reenactment of his landing occurred right at the start of the celebrations and inaugurated the whole celebrations period.
50 years earlier, the 1888 centenary of settlement ignored Philip almost completely. But it did not ignore Australia's place in the empire. Lady Carrington, wife of the governor, unveiled a statue of Queen Victoria.
The ceremony of unveiling was but momentary, though full of meaning and interest. It was performed with electric quickness in the presence of thousands, through whose minds must have passed, with equal rapidity, the thought that they were not only honouring the Queen, but the constitutional system of government which they enjoy under her reign.
A governor would not regard himself as being part of the royal family, but very much from 1930s onward, they regarded themselves as taking the place of the King or the Queen later on in Australia. They were meant to be a kind of a surrogate royal family. They saw themselves in that role, and many Australians regarded them as having that role.
The organisers of the 1938 celebrations were unable to secure the services of a member of the royal family. Perhaps what they did was opt for Philip instead. Philip as a governor, as a representative of the Crown in Australia, and also as the historical figure who had inaugurated British rule in Australia, seemed an appropriate person.
I see the governor as being the tip of an imperial iceberg, very much the visible sign of a very large and powerful body. And many Australians were quite happy to be on the iceberg. And at the same time, some people would attack the tip or would feel that the kind of representation of the tip was not what they wanted. But basically, they were quite happy to have the iceberg as being their support, rather than to strike off into the very dangerous and hazardous seas of the 30s in any kind of independent way.
Philip's speech was written by Carl Cramp, a government schools inspector and president of the Royal Australian Historical Society. Cramp controlled the form and content of the 1938 reenactment. Like everyone else, Cramp made Philip's speech up. He drew upon the many other versions produced by years of myth-making. Nor was he interested in presenting a full picture of the first white settlement. He wanted a bright, attractive spectacle. Convicts, who represented a murkier imperial past, had little part in Cramp's scenario.
The people who organised the celebrations were influenced by 19th century writers who believed in the role of heroes in history. History was made by great men. That masculine perspective was in the imperial culture.
Cramp's version put a special emphasis on the idea of Philip as a visionary figure. His promise of prosperity was quite particular. It was a promise of the benefits of imperial trade. It was a promise that in 1938, Australia could still be Britain's most valuable acquisition.
It is therefore appropriate that I should express the vision which comes to me of a city stupendous in area and population, and of this magnificent harbour visited by merchantmen of all sizes, designs and nationalities, bringing goods for the growing population in this land and taking away the surplus produce of its soil.
The figure of Arthur Phillip, the father of the nation, standing for British enterprise and British foresight in imagining this great prosperity that he sees before him in 1938, seems to reinforce or symbolise a link that holds together Australia with Britain. It's often rather forced, I think. You sometimes find Phillip superimposed over Sydney Harbour Bridge, or sometimes looking at a sea of wheat. But it appears to symbolise, for me anyhow, the links between Britain and Australia in the establishment of colonies and then in the operation of the industrial economy.
Few ports in the British Empire exceed the volume of shipping which passes in and out of Sydney Harbour. The aggregate gross tonnage this year reached the peak of over 19 million tons. Australia produces butter valued at 23 million, of which she exports nearly one half. Eggs, canned and dried fruit, wine, metals and minerals are the principal exports, which in the brief span of 150 years have made Australia the most stable and prosperous of nations.
Australia's privileged access to British markets was regarded as a prime benefit of membership of the Empire. But though many Australians wanted it, in 1938 the Empire was not, in fact, a closely knit trading bloc.
Australia had borrowed very heavily from Britain in the 1920s on the basis of investment to increase the size of its economy. And it had got into considerable difficulties in managing those loans in the 1930s. As a result of that, Australia was having to try very hard to maintain a favourable trade balance. It sold about half of its exports to Britain, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain that privileged relationship between Australian and British producers and consumers. During the 1930s, Australia was once again generally able to maintain a favourable trade balance, but it was increasingly difficult for that large trading bloc that we could call the British Empire to satisfy Australia's economic needs.
The Australian government saw the nation's economic interests as identical to those of the Empire and regarded imperial sentiment as the natural basis of imperial trade policy. The British government had a different approach. It saw imperial sentiment as a substitute for the kind of concessions Australia sought.
Sometimes when people proclaim very loudly their imperial loyalty, they do so because they're worried that it might be, or the economic basis of it, might be disappearing. And to some extent, I think we see that in the 1930s. Yes, the empire was important to Australia economically, but it was of declining importance, and its future was less assured. And the attempt to reassert it with a number of devices, including the way in which the sesquicentenary was celebrated, is, I think, quite instructive about how the business of empire is carried on.
You know, my dear, two of our greatest nation builders were Captain John MacArthur and the Reverend Samuel Marsden. They were the men who laid the foundations of our great national wool industry. Look, Peter, there's Captain John MacArthur there on the right. And that's the Reverend Samuel Marsden. They're at MacArthur's farm at Camden.
By the way, how did you fare with your last clip?
Most satisfying. It realized top prices in London and was classed equal to the finest Saxon.
Good news. If we can increase the export of wool of such quality, It would develop the colony to a great destiny.
The film A Nation is Built, made by the legendary photographer Frank Hurley, was commissioned for the 1938 anniversary. It was shown in cinemas as part of the celebrations and also used to promote Australian trade and industry overseas. As an account of the nation, it leaves out a great deal, but provides as good an instance of how the early history of Australia was presented imperially, with Governor Phillip as its figurehead.
Your Excellency seems strangely thoughtful on this memorable day. Dreaming of the old homeland?
No, Collins, of this new land. A vision that this means settlement may one day achieve greatness, and become the most valuable acquisition Great Britain ever made.
But this was not the only way of interpreting Phillip. Marjorie Barnard and Flora Eldershaw were members of a circle of progressive writers, many of them women, which emerged in the 1930s. They wrote fiction and history together under the pseudonym M. Barnard Eldershaw. In 1998, they produced a biography of Phillip. The very title of Phillip of Australia underlined their nationalist purpose. For them, his vision was of an egalitarian democratic nation, rather than an efficient empire. Barnard Eldershaw's Phillip saw the possibility of an Australian society that was free and fair.
As we look back 150 years, the first 5 years of Australia, Phillip's governorship, hang like a bright medallion against the anonymous centuries that lie behind them. It is not so long ago, and yet it is all time as far as white Australia is concerned. It was a beginning without glamour, and the settlement was without inner cohesion. It was kept together by discipline and necessity. It was fused together into a community, a new entity by one man, Phillip. He not only fashioned it, he created it.
Barnard Eldershaw's view of Phillip was shared in the liberal press. You see Phillip being presented as the suitably democratic founder of the nation at a time of increasing concern in Australia about the rise of fascism in Europe and in Australia. You have to remember that the political power of governors of New South Wales had been exercised in 1932. Governor Game had made a remarkable intervention into the ordinary political process when he dismissed the Labor Premier, Jack Lang. But according to Barnard Eldershaw and the Daily Telegraph, for example, it was entirely because of the efforts of the first Governor of New South Wales, Arthur Phillip, that civil and democratic traditions were strong in Australia.
He foresaw the inevitable rise of that system of society in which the function of government is shared by all, in which there is no privilege, no dictatorship, no abuse of justice for personal end.
The new nation reaffirms loyalty to king and empire. An important feature of the celebrations is the Government House garden party, where Lord and Lady Wakehurst welcome prominent citizens and visitors from abroad. So in an atmosphere of dignity and fashion, the community celebrates its beginning and its years of increasing achievement.
But the official Phillip of 1938 was a resolute imperialist. His promise was a reassurance for that whole Australian elite closely attached to Britain and naturally disturbed by Britain's diminishing power to influence world events and to compete with the newer industrial economies. The culture of the empire was deeply entrenched in Australian life. Australian governments attended to the deliberations of Westminster and Whitehall. The higher levels of Australian finance and commerce borrowed money from London. Australian law was a small and subordinate part of the English legal system. Budding Australian intellectuals longed to train at English universities. Australian journalism reported world events via Fleet Street. And the most powerful Protestant church was the Church of England. Across all those networks of attachment and identification, there was a genuine belief that Australian interests were best served by an exclusive imperial relationship. Australia's future lay within the empire. The degree to which Australia's rulers were able to sustain that belief is most clearly indicated by their confidence in Britain's ability to protect Australia from attack.
The 30s were a dangerous period of international strife and trade and depression and rivalry, and Australians tended to want to huddle closer within the empire. And the ultimate end of this was to be in World War II, when Australians were prepared to join with the British Empire unquestionably and fight in a war that they regarded as being their war as much as Britain's war. When Prime Minister Menzies declared that Australia was at war because the British Empire was at war, he didn't feel there was any necessity to declare war upon Germany himself. He felt that the imperial government decided foreign policy for the empire and therefore for Australia.
Such was the faith in empire until 1941. After the war, it was never completely regained. The 1938 celebrations were a late and Baroque expression of that faith.
148, 149, 150. Hey, Mother, I bet Governor Phillips never had a cake like this.
No, my dear, it was a very different sort of cake that he had to share with his early settlers, wasn't it, Father?
A nasty cake. Iced with plenty of trouble and every slice a bitter problem.
If it hadn't been for Governor Phillips, we wouldn't be keeping up our country's birthday now.
Yes, my dear. Lord Sydney chose the right man to extend the British Empire in Australia.